Jesus being all to us, to have God that's interested in all of us, not part of us, all of us. Doesn't that just blow your mind? That God sees you, mistakes that you've made, disappointments that you've caused, the path that you have willingly chosen to walk down. God sees all of that and loves you anyway. Friends, that is good news. That is good news. So thank you for just bringing that sweet offering to one another and to God. Let's turn on your Bibles to Luke chapter 14, beginning of verse 25. If you're on a tablet or a phone, I'm actually using the NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version. That's actually the version Jesus used. So go to the NRSV. That's a joke. I'm kidding. Mine's just more right than yours. I'm sorry. For those that don't know me, that really is a joke. Luke chapter 14, verse 25. Before I read, I think a lot about preaching as it relates to the content that goes into a sermon. There's a lot to think about. And one of the interesting things about having children is that I get to control the content to a certain point that they watch or experience. Have you ever noticed that little box up in the right-hand corner or the left-hand corner of your television? It's a rating. Perhaps it says Y or 7 or... And you're familiar with ratings because you go to movies. Sometimes they're PG, sometimes they're PG-13, sometimes they're R, which means stay away. Well, they have those ratings for television, for video games, for music. And this is the rating that scares me the most. Mature audiences. What that's code for is don't let an immature audience watch this because they may not be able to handle the content. So I want to confess this morning that I wished, as your preacher this week, I could flash this up on the screen and we could just skip this sermon and head into next Sunday. Because this is for mature audiences only. We don't like the Bible to be offensive, much less Jesus to be offensive. And yet, here's the text that we have before us this morning. And Luke has given it an MA rating. It's the Word of God for the people of God. Large crowds were traveling with him, and Jesus turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace or surrender. So, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Mature audiences only. It's a turning point that happens in every gospel story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the way they tell this story of Jesus begins with the life and ministry of Jesus, some with its birth, others with the drafting of the disciples. But there's this moment where Jesus walks with his disciples, heals people, performs miracles. But there's this moment. And it's here that Luke throws up a rating for our ears and says, I'd like to interrupt this gospel presentation and just assure everyone that this is for mature disciples only. And if you haven't noticed, Jesus is a pretty popular guy. Turn over back to chapter 12. We miss some of these details. Have you noticed the people following Jesus around? It's in chapter 12, verse 1. I'm not making this up. Meanwhile, when the crowds gathered by the thousands, so that they trampled on one another, he began to speak. It's a Donald Trump rally. Thousands of people listening to one human being, and it's so crazy and chaotic, they began to trample one another. In chapter 13, look around verse 20, 21, 22. Jesus continues to teach, but there's this one little tidbit that Luke throws in there. Jesus went through one town and village after another, teaching as he made his way to Jerusalem. Jesus is not just teaching. Crowds are not just trampling one another. Jesus is headed somewhere, and this morning Luke says you need to stop, because from this point forward, it's for mature audiences only. Jesus invites his disciples to the cross, to suffering. Did you hear the language Jesus used? Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. You know, I try to think about what it would have been like to listen to Jesus at this point. You ever talked with somebody with a migraine? I mean, they're just mad for all kinds of different reasons, but it doesn't have anything to do with you. They're just kind of, hacked off at the world because they've got a headache. Sometimes I wonder if people are sitting there going, oh, great, Jesus has got a migraine. Step back. Because we really don't think Jesus means to actually hate your mother, your father. Do you really think Jesus meant that? Or perhaps Jesus was like my high school soccer coach, who was a former Marine at coaching high school soccer students. Drop down and give me 25, and we'd all have to drop down and give 25 push-ups. Now run 2 miles. 2 miles? Are you 2 miles? So we take off running, and we think, this guy has lost his mind. Who does he think we are? Or maybe Jesus is like my 8th grade English teacher, Miss Luther, who no one ever took seriously, yet she spoke in hyperbole all the time. If you don't turn this work in, I'm going to make you do write-offs for 2 weeks straight. Nobody turned their work in. Nobody did any write-offs. She just liked to threaten. She retired after my 8th grade year, probably why. But is this the migraine Jesus, the head coach Jesus, the teacher Jesus that can't get a control of his audience? What Jesus are we dealing with? I'd like to suggest this morning that Luke is inviting us into a very dangerous, offensive space that I would just assume avoid. And he's saying, if your allegiance isn't to me first, and if you are not willing to go where I am going, you can't be my disciple. Suffering is what you signed up for. I can remember when I first got into preaching, I liked to gather myself around other preachers, and there were several of us in our early 30s that met with one of our preaching heroes, Lynn Anderson, If you don't know who Lynn Anderson is, picture Michael Jordan of basketball. This would be the Michael Jordan of preaching. I mean, Lynn started out the Highland Church in Abilene, then went to Preston Road. He founded Hope Network. I mean, this guy knows preaching. So we sit around Lynn Anderson, and he's giving out wisdom and wisdom. We're all at the edge of our seats. And then he closes with this. He says, I want to share with you what I'm going to pray specifically for each one of you as you preach. Ooh, I got to the edge of my seat. I could not wait to hear what Lynn Anderson says. And he looked, his voice didn't shake or quiver, and he said this, I'm going to pray that you suffer. I wanted to quit right then. Really? Suffer? Can't you pick something else to pray for? No, because what Lynn was trying to help us understand is that you cannot separate suffering from the life of Jesus. You can't get to Easter through the cross. Yet you and I, in our very Western selves, try to avoid suffering at all costs. One of my favorite writers, Richard Rohr, says that each one of us go through 3 different boxes over the course of our lives. Society, people, and this is what the boxes look like. The first is the box of order. This is where things make sense. Questions have answers. Problems are solved. And although you might have questions about why the sky is blue or why does 2 + 2 = 4, you simply trust the system that you're a part of. It makes sense. Until you move to box number 2, which is the box of disorder. This is where life comes unraveled. This is where your whole world falls apart. Death of a loved one, illness, something that doesn't have a nice, tidy answer. Disorder. But, Rohr says, there's always reorder. And this is how you make sense of the disorder that's come from the world that was ordered a particular way. But now that the world has been reframed, you can now live with hopeful expectation. Live in the tension of unanswered questions. Live with the maturity of looking back on your life and saying, this is what it all means. And then Rohr makes the following observation. None of us like to stay in box 2. We want to go immediately from box 1 to box 3 and avoid box 2 altogether. Wouldn't you agree? Who in their right mind signs up for suffering? Not you, not me. Yet this is exactly what Jesus is inviting the disciples into. If you want to be my disciple, if you want mature discipleship, suffering is a part of the journey. To become a true disciple, you must suffer. So we gather around the Michael Jordan of our faith, and we lean in as Jesus says, let me tell you what I want from each one of you. Take up your cross and follow me. Well, that's good news for us Christians. We like the cross. We like the cross to a certain point. Have you noticed how we sing about the cross? On a hill far away. We don't want to be too close, as long as that hill is far away. When I survey we can survey it. As long as we don't have to get on the cross, we can look at the cross. Have you thought about this one? At the cross, where I first saw the light. It's a great song. You know how that song ends? Now I am happy all the day. Really? What's so happy about someone being publicly executed? What kind of sick people are we? This is one reason why I have deep respect for the Catholic Church. Now go with me for just a moment. If you turn on the news next week and watch Pope Francis as he's giving Mass to the Vatican, Pope Francis will have a gigantic cross that he's holding, but it's not going to look like this one. Do you know why? Because the Catholic cross has the body of Jesus upon it. Because if you're Catholic, you cannot separate the fact of the cross from human suffering. Folks, we are missing something if our cross fails to have a body on it. I am all for resurrection. I am all for hope of the empty tomb, but you can't get there without going through a life of suffering, through a life of the cross. And we want to minimize it. We want to stand far away. We don't want to get too close because it's hard. That's box 2. Yet Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you've got to wrestle with box 2, and none of you are exempt from suffering. And I think what Jesus is doing is he's inviting us into a way of seeing, viewing suffering. And perhaps that's what Jesus is attempting to do by talking about a person building a tower or a king going to battle. You need to count the cost before you decide to follow me. Consider the cost. I consider the cost every day. And you know what? I love a good discount or a coupon, don't you? I was in a conversation last night. This person said, hey, I'm going to buy this thing for this thing I'm going to. It's on sale, and guess what? I've got a coupon to get a discount for what's already on sale. Don't you love a good coupon? Don't you love a good discount? I will not stop at Sonic unless it's happy hour or before 10 a.m. I'm not paying full price. Why would I? Amen. And yet we want the same thing with Jesus. Give me a discounted cross. I want a coupon. I want to get out of suffering free card. And we're surprised. When we live, we exist in box number 2. And it just tears me apart to hear preachers announcing, it's going to be okay. It's life, it's just wonderful. No, it's not. Sometimes it's not okay, and it's okay for it not to be okay. Jesus does not give us a coupon. He says, if you want to follow me, you're going to suffer. So what does suffering look like? Well, sometimes for me, it's helpful to think about what it's not. Some of us think that suffering is like a moral obligation. That's what I dealt with for like 13 months. Let me rephrase that. That's what my wife dealt with for like 13 months. Everybody told us, ooh, baby number 4, it's going to be your best one. It's going to be easy. None of our kids slept a wink till they were like 2 years old. I mean, it was terrible. It's an exaggeration, but it's what it felt like. And I can remember holding my 4th, knowing that it was going to be my last, thinking, oh, why am I suffering through this? Can't we just get on with the growing up? Look, nobody in their right mind is going to not hold a baby in the middle of the night. You may not like it, but it is your obligation to do that. Just like it's your obligation to take care of your mom or your dad or your friend or your coworker. Friends, that is not the suffering Jesus has in mind. Suffering is not equal to your moral duty as a human being. Suffering is not also inconvenience. We know inconvenience here in Dallas, Texas. We love 635 until it looks like this. And sometimes I think, why do we have to suffer through this? Especially when you're driving along 635 in this kind of mess with no air conditioning in August. Jesus wouldn't call that suffering. Jesus would call that a first world problem. So you have to wait a little longer. Well, I guess we'll just suffer through it. Really? Is that the kind of suffering Jesus is talking about? Or perhaps the hardest one for me to wrestle with is the thought I have whenever I see this. Now let me go ahead and help some of you out. This was suffering for me as a teenager, so I thought. Is walking out in a field full of square bales, knowing that you've got to pick up every last one of them with your hands. Throw them onto a truck, stack them so neatly so when you drive out of the field, the whole truck doesn't fall over and you lose all 400 or 500 square bales that you just spent the last 3 or 4 hours loading in the hot, burning sun. I'm not wounded, trust me. But suffering isn't just hard work. Sometimes I think because we live paycheck to paycheck or something gets hard, that's somehow suffering. Obligation, inconvenience, hard work. I'm not sure that's what Jesus has in mind. Because here's the thing. I get to have control in every one of those circumstances. And as one writer puts it, suffering is when you don't have any control. Which is perhaps why Jesus closes with this. None of you can become my disciple if you don't give up all your possessions. And I have to wonder if Jesus isn't just talking about our stuff, but he's talking about the safety and security that our stuff brings. Abandon your safety and security. Abandon your right to control. Then come follow me. Then come take up the cross. And that's what's so painful about this message. This is what's so hard about box number 2. I don't like it. I don't like to watch my friends in this church family suffer from cancer. I don't like to watch people lose their husbands or to lose their wives. I don't like little babies to be born that have to be ushered into the NICU because something went wrong. If I could alleviate suffering, I would. And I have to think that the God of the universe that spoke light into darkness could alleviate suffering if he could. But he chose not to. It's not just God inviting us into a way of suffering. It's God saying, follow me into suffering. God suffers. And as much as I want to bypass box 2, as much as I want to avoid the cross, diminish the cross, take away the pain, the agony, the blood, the offensiveness of the cross, as much as I long for Easter, this morning, Luke simply says this: not yet. Not yet. You cannot be my disciple unless you suffer. Those who have ears to hear these hard words of God.